Hello anatomy students. Today we're going to talk about muscle metabolism, or basically the ways in which our muscle cells generate ATP in order to power the contraction cycle and other metabolic reactions that need to occur in order for our muscle fibers to function. So there are three general ways in which our muscle cells can generate ATP. The first way is by the synthesis and the breakdown of creatine phosphate. The second way is through anaerobic glycolysis, and the third way is through aerobic respiration. Now, in this video lecture, once we talk about those three things, we're going to talk about two other phenomena called muscle fatigue and oxygen debt. Now, as you're probably already aware, our muscle cells have to use a lot of ATP in order to power the contraction cycle, right? You should remember that you need ATP in order for cross bridges to form and for cross bridges to release so that new ones can form. And you also need ATP in order to return our calcium ions back into the sarcoplasmic reticulum. And there are other processes that our muscle fibers need ATP for. So where does all of this ATP even come from? That's what I'm going to answer for you in this lecture. So when a muscle fiber is at rest, let's start there, it's going to generate more ATP than it needs. And you can't store ATP directly. Like, there is no vesicle that you can just pack it into. Instead, what the muscle fibers do is they use ATP to create a molecule called creatine phosphate. Creatine is a small amino acid-like molecule that's generated in the kidneys, in the pancreas, in the liver, and then it's transported to the muscle cells. And there, the muscle cells are going to use all of this excess ATP that they've generated in order to create creatine phosphate. And here's how it works. Our muscle fibers have an enzyme called creatine kinase, CK, and the CK is going to catalyze the breaking of one of the high energy bonds from ATP. So it's going to remove a high energy phosphate from ATP, and it's going to create adenosine diphosphate instead. It's going to take that high energy phosphate from ATP and attach it to a creatine molecule to create creatine phosphate. So the creatine phosphate is just going to hang out in the muscle cell until it's needed. Now, when the muscle cell starts to contract, it's going to need ATP, and it's going to need ATP right away, and it gets it from the creatine phosphate. So once again, when the muscle fiber starts contracting, our enzyme CK is going to come in and catalyze the removal of the phosphate from creatine, thus creating just plain old creatine. It's not creatine phosphate anymore. And it's going to attach that phosphate to an ADP molecule to create ATP, which can then bind to the myosin and allow the cross-bridge cycle to occur. And so that's how creatine phosphate helps the muscle fiber to contract. But it's really just a starting point, because we only have enough creatine phosphate in our muscles to give us about 15 seconds of ATP for contraction. Like, it's only going to last about that long. So there's got to be another way for our muscle cells to generate ATP at the start of muscle contraction. And that's going to be through anaerobic glycolysis. Anaerobic glycolysis is happening in the absence of oxygen. And it's going to produce a little bit more ATP than the creatine phosphate will, right? Like, for each creatine phosphate that was broken apart, you only got one ATP molecule. But here, you're getting two ATP molecules. So basically what's happening, we're talking about anaerobic glycolysis. This is the breakup of glucose that's happening in the absence of oxygen. Where is this glucose coming from? Well, first of all, our muscle fibers are going to have a store of glycogen. And glycogen is a huge branched molecule that's made up of these building blocks. And the building blocks are glucose molecules. So just by breaking the bonds in between the glucose molecules, you're able to get glucose into the sarcoplasm of the cell, and it's able to be used in anaerobic glycolysis in order to generate ATP. The other source of glucose is from the blood. So just from your bloodstream, you've got glucose that's floating around in there, and it can passively diffuse into the muscle fibers. So all of this glucose is going to be broken apart through a process called glycolysis, which is happening in the absence of oxygen. Now, don't get confused though, because glycolysis can happen in the presence of oxygen too. It's just that we're at just the beginning of muscle contraction, so we probably haven't even started to increase our respiratory rate yet. So we don't really have a lot of oxygen, in our cells yet. So that's why our muscles switched from creatine phosphate catabolism to anaerobic glycolysis, because we just don't have the oxygen that we need yet. So here's what's happening. Glucose is broken up in the absence of oxygen via glycolysis, and it's going to yield 2 ATP, but it's also going to produce 2 pyruvic acids. Now remember, this is in the absence of oxygen. The pyruvic acid would go into the mitochondria and into the aerobic respiration cycle if we had enough oxygen, but in this case we don't. And so what happens to the pyruvic acid is it gets converted to 2 lactic acid molecules, and under optimal conditions the lactic acid molecules are just going to diffuse out of the cells, go into the blood, and then it can be picked up by the liver and then changed back into glucose and recycled as more fuel for our anaerobic glycolysis cycle. But if lactic acid starts to build up, it's thought that it's one of the main culprits of muscle soreness during and after exercise. Oh, and I wanted to mention one more thing. Lactic acid is an acid. So when it enters the blood, it's going to drop the pH, making the blood more acidic. When the liver removes that lactic acid from the blood, it's restoring the blood back up to its normal pH. So the liver is going to help to maintain normal blood pH by removing lactic acid from the blood. So I just wanted to make sure that I mentioned that. And the last thing I want to say on this slide is that the duration of energy provided by anaerobic glycolysis is 2 minutes. So again, not a whole lot of ATP is being produced. So how are our muscle contractions supported? Here's how. Through aerobic respiration. Aerobic respiration is going to start off with glycolysis, but now it's happening in the presence of oxygen. And so you're still getting glucose from the blood, you're still getting glucose from the glycogen stores that are found in the muscle fibers, except now, in the presence of oxygen, the pyruvic acid that is produced goes into the mitochondria, and it's going to enter some chemical processes that require oxygen, namely the Krebs cycle and the electron transport chain. And what's going to be produced here are heat, 30 to 32 ATP molecules, carbon dioxide, and water. So this is really just a combustion reaction that's also generating some energy here, right? And that's what's happening here. Now, the duration of energy provided is several minutes to hours. It's slower, like aerobic respiration is slower than anaerobic respiration, but clearly it's providing our muscle cells with the energy that it needs in order to sustain contractions for a long period of time. The other thing I want to make mention is that oxygen is not the only thing that's necessary. We also need certain nutrients. And as you can see in the different colored boxes that I have on the slide, we're getting nutrients such as amino acids. We need fatty acids. We need pyruvic acid, which is coming from glycolysis. So we need other things to break down in order to generate this much ATP. So once again, the three ways that our muscle fibers are going to generate ATP are through creatine phosphate. That's going to be the way that it happens first. Again, not much ATP, only one ATP molecule per creatine phosphate that is broken up. The next way, it's going to shift into anaerobic respiration. Anaerobic respiration generates 2 ATP molecules for every glucose molecule. And then that pyruvic acid is converted to lactic acid, which then leaves the muscle cell and gets recycled in the liver back to glucose. And then after that, our muscle fibers will switch to aerobic respiration, where we're going to get 30 to 32 molecules of ATP, provided that we have the oxygen and the nutrients necessary. I also just wanted to make one last mention here that our oxygen is coming from, we're breathing it in, we're inhaling it, but most of our oxygen is going to be bound to a protein in our blood called hemoglobin. And our muscle fibers have a special oxygen binding molecule in their sarcoplasm called myoglobin. And the way myoglobin and hemoglobin are going to work similarly, in that when oxygen levels are low, they are going to change their configuration and release oxygen for use by the muscle cells. When oxygen levels are high, then they retain and kind of store. They're like a storage place for oxygen molecules, so that those oxygen molecules can be at the ready when they're needed for muscle contraction. All right, now let's talk about a phenomenon called muscle fatigue. Muscle fatigue is defined as the decreased force of contraction after prolonged activity. And it results mainly from changes that occur in the muscle fibers, but oftentimes it actually begins with changes that are occurring in the central nervous system. And this is something that's called central fatigue. So while somebody is exercising, like before actual muscle fatigue occurs, the person is going to start to feel exhausted, and they're going to feel the desire to stop exercise. And it's thought that maybe this central fatigue is a defense mechanism or a protective mechanism to protect the muscle fibers from being damaged from overexertion. But muscle fatigue that's happening by changes within the muscle cells include a lack of calcium ions that are found in the sarcoplasm. Also, a depletion of creatine phosphate that's found in the muscle cells, or maybe the person doesn't have enough oxygen, or they've depleted their nutrient sources. Or maybe they have too much ADP and too great a buildup of lactic acid in their muscle fibers. Another source of muscle fatigue could be the failure for a motor neuron to release enough acetylcholine to stimulate a muscle fiber at the neuromuscular junction. And so, all of those things, that I've listed here on the slide, besides central fatigue, all of the other things are kind of issues that are happening with the muscle fiber. And central fatigue, those feelings of wanting to stop exercise, happens before all of those things can happen, because that can cause some damage to the muscle fibers, and the body it's believed, is just trying to prevent that from happening. So that's what muscle fatigue is. It's kind of part physiologic and maybe part psychologic. All right, another thing that I just wanted to bring up is something that's called oxygen debt, or maybe a better term for it is recovery oxygen uptake. And as you all know, during exercise, your breathing rates are going to go up, and your blood flow is going to increase to your muscle fibers, and this is all going to function in order to bring as much oxygen as possible to your muscle cells. And once you've stopped contractions, your breathing rate and depth are still going to be higher than normal. Sometimes, again, depending on how strenuous your exercise is, that can go on for a very long period of time. And what happens is that the amount of oxygen that your body takes in after exercise is higher than the amount that it actually needs at rest. And historically, this has been called oxygen debt. And the idea was that you're breathing in more and more oxygen in order to pay back the oxygen, or to replenish the oxygen that was used during activity. And that would be a really great way to describe it if, once those levels equaled out, then your respiratory rate and the depth of your respirations kind of went back to normal. But oftentimes they don't. So what is the purpose of all of this extra oxygen that you're bringing into the body? Well, all of this oxygen is required because your body needs energy, needs ATP, in order to restore the metabolic conditions back to normal. So your metabolic conditions change, right? They change from normal to something different, higher, while you're actually exercising. And so it's going to require energy in order to get back to normal. And in order to generate ATP, what do you need? You need oxygen. And so your body has to take in more oxygen than what it needs at the baseline, more oxygen than what it needs at rest. And so how is it going to restore these metabolic conditions? Well, in 3 ways, which I have with these bullet points here. So first, it's going to, the body is going to convert lactic acid to glycogen in the liver. So the lactic acid that has built up in the muscles, it needs to diffuse into the blood, and it's got to be taken out of the blood by the liver in order to maintain the blood's normal pH. The second thing is that the muscle cells, again, now that they're not contracting anymore, they're at rest, they need to generate more ATP, and that ATP is going to be used to create creatine phosphate, which is what I was talking about on the very first slide, right? You can't just store ATP, it's got to be stored as a different molecule. That molecule is creatine phosphate, and so the enzyme creatine kinase is going to catalyze the making of creatine phosphate from ATP. And then what's building up in the cells is ADP and creatine phosphate. And then the muscle cell is going to be ready with this, store of creatine phosphate. It's going to be ready for when those muscles need to contract again. And then also, the muscle fibers need to replenish its store of oxygen to the myoglobin molecules that are found in the sarcoplasm of the muscle cells. So during all of this exercise, the myoglobin gave up all of its oxygen, right? Because that's what myoglobin does. When oxygen is depleted, it's going to release its oxygen for use by the muscle cells to generate ATP. Well, you've got to put that back. And so that's another way that the body is going to restore metabolic conditions. But those three things that I just mentioned really only account for a part of the amount of oxygen that's coming back into the body. There are chemical reactions that are happening now at faster rates all over the body. Why? Because your internal body temperature has increased with the exercise. Heat is a part is a product of aerobic respiration, and that's going to increase metabolic processes, physiologic processes all over the body. And so the other thing is that the heart and the muscles that are in between the ribs, if you're breathing deeper, faster, they are still contracting. So they still need that ATP, even though your skeletal muscles may not, be contracting, those muscles are. And they still need ATP in order to perform those contractions so that you can breathe and so that you can bring more of that oxygen into the body. And then finally, there are other physiologic processes like tissue repair that also require ATP. And so all of that is, again, it's happening at a faster rate. And so your body needs to bring in more oxygen in order to allow that to happen, in order to generate the ATP for all of those tissue repairs. And so some authors have proposed that a better term is recovery oxygen uptake instead of oxygen debt, because the amount of oxygen after exercise that you're taking into your body exceeds what you need at rest. But the reasons why are basically to restore metabolic conditions and to support all of these other chemical reactions that are happening in the body due to an increase in body temperature that occurred as a result of that exercise. All right, so we just talked about 3 ways in which our muscle fibers generate ATP. We talked about the causes of muscle fatigue, and we also talked about recovery oxygen uptake, or the reasons why your body takes in more oxygen than what it needs at rest once exercise is completed. I hope that you enjoyed this video, and I hope that you enjoyed learning some new things. I'll talk to you in class. Really, I'll talk to you in class.